So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Ann Neal.
Well, thank you so much, and good morning to everyone. I appreciate your having me with your coffee this morning, and I want to thank Morton Blackwell and Carla Bruno and all of you in this room for all the things that you do. Thank you for understanding that we as citizens in a democratic republic must be informed and engaged. I certainly don't need to tell you we have a remarkable country, and I, for one, am immensely grateful to the dead white males who founded it. But I am also acutely aware that what we have is conditional. If you can keep it, Benjamin Franklin so aptly stated when asked about the democratic republic that he and the founders had just created in Independence Hall. So today I'm going to talk to you a bit about the if part of the equation. I'm going to talk to you about various threats to the quality and affordability of American higher education, which more broadly threaten our democratic republic. I'm going to talk to you about what the American Council of Trustees and Alumni is doing about it and what you in this room can do to help us return our colleges and universities to first principles so that we can retain the freest, most wonderful nation on earth. As Thomas Jefferson so eloquently understood, and I must say I generally try to favor George Washington, but today I will quote Thomas Jefferson, "If a nation expects to be ignorant and free in a state of civilization, it wants what never was and never will be." So let's take a brief look at American higher education and what's happening today. Across the board, American higher education is absolutely the finest in the world. It offers the highest quality at the lowest cost. April Fools! Regrettably, American higher education is facing a crisis of quality and cost, and I want to examine just a few of the disturbing trends. Now, we all know that prices seem to go up perpetually, but never is that more true than when it comes to higher education. As you can see in this slide, over the past 25 years, tuitions have gone up 440%. In fact, 4 times the rate of inflation and almost twice the rate of health care. And students are having to take out loans as never before. Today, student loan debt exceeds $1.2 trillion. It is larger than consumer debt. It is a serious, serious problem. So American families, quite frankly, are being priced out of the American dream. And while I think most people would believe that health care's quality has gone up along with the price, it's a harder sell when it comes to higher education. The fact is that we in the United States spend nearly twice the average per pupil on higher education than any other industrialized nation, and yet our graduation rates are below the OECD average. They are hovering at around 40% after 4 years. And this is something we can talk about in the Q&A. Today, the Department of Education only keeps official stats for 6 years. So the old 4-year degree in 4 years has virtually disappeared. Now, the Department of Education's own survey, the National Assessment of Adult Literacy, shows that college graduates are graduating without even basic proficiency. What does that mean? That means they cannot compare 2 editorials or compute the cost of office goods. And these are college graduates. Another eye-opening study that was put out by the University of Chicago shows that a paltry 36% of students are graduating with actual student learning gains. And I'm sure many of you in this room well know, employers, meanwhile, are not happy. They complain of recent graduates who can't write a coherent paragraph or do basic math. And since we were talking about George Washington, let me spread the alarm about historical amnesia, an area in which ACTA has long been involved. There is mounting evidence that we Americans are losing touch with our history and heritage. And when ACTA surveys college graduates about their history and civic knowledge, quite frankly, we are just appalled. More students can identify Lady Gaga than the general at Yorktown. Only 20% can identify Madison as the father of the Constitution, and this is not an April Fool's joke. Another survey found that 62% of college graduates cannot even identify the length of the terms of Congress. So we really have to ask ourselves, how can we be engaged in our democratic system if, in fact, we don't even know when we're supposed to go and vote? So why is this happening? Quite frankly, because too many of our colleges are failing to do their job. Every year, the American Council of Trustees and Alumni surveys about 1,100 colleges and universities around the country. And what we find, again, is most terrifying. Only 18% of colleges and universities that we surveyed require their graduates to study American history or government. Less than 4% require economics. And I think, given these results, it should not be a surprise that Americans are increasingly fed up. Recent public opinion polls find that 60% of people think that colleges mainly care about their bottom line, and they are not really focused on providing students with a quality education. 83% of the public surveyed agreed that students have to borrow too much money to pay for college, and a majority of the public say that colleges can do better with the money they have. Now, this, quite frankly, stands in stark contrast with the findings of a survey of those inside the academy. College and university presidents surveyed outlined their belief that higher ed cost, quality, and access exist in an iron triangle. Higher ed cannot be expected to cut costs without an attendant decline in quality or access. Yes, there are still some inefficiencies, these presidents will admit, but generally speaking, higher ed has done all it conceivably could do to be cost effective. And I know you all each and every day read your newspapers where we hear that the state appropriations have gone down, and of course, what is the only possible reaction? To raise tuition. Again, I think a serious, serious problem. So given these perspectives, one thing is clear. If we want to move the debate, we are going to have to do things differently. And in states across the country, it's time to examine both sides of the budget equation, controlling costs and enhancing revenue, as well as finding ways to improve quality. Ever-rising tuitions and income redistribution are not the answer, no matter what the Washington Post would have you believe. And that is why we should give credit to Governor Scott Walker and any other governors, Republican or Democrat, conservative or liberal, who call for greater teacher productivity, more efficient practices in higher education, and keeping tuition costs low. Far from undermining education, this is a conversation that will actually help sustain education. Now, I know you all have been reading about the disruptive power of technology and how we're seeing fairly massive change in the higher education landscape, upending old practices, and that is indeed true. But I want to talk for today's purposes about bricks and mortar institutions because for the most part they are not going to go away. And I think we really have to get these institutions to do things correctly because our democratic republic relies upon them to prepare graduates for success in the workforce, success as citizens, and lifelong learners. So let me tell you just briefly about the vision of the American Council of Trustees and Alumni, because we are working each and every day with thousands of trustees across the country to return traditional liberal arts education. Here is a set of 10 questions that we have given to more than 17,000 trustees across the country. We've made a wallet card, and we have advised these trustees, take this with you to your board meetings so that you can keep key questions front and center. We're also working with schools to require a core curriculum. A survey conducted for us by GFK Roper of recent college graduates found that 83% had wished that they had a strong core curriculum, no doubt when faced with the stark reality of getting a job. I hope you will take a look at what our What Will They Learn website chronicles across the country, and you all have the booklet at the table. In it, you can see which schools are doing a good job of requiring a coherent curriculum, which schools are A's, for instance, Pepperdine, the University of Georgia, Baylor, Christopher Newport. So I hope you will take a look at those and that you will share them with your family. You can also find there the sticker price and whether the school has a speech code code that inhibits protected speech on college campuses. And sadly, far too many of our colleges and universities do. Of the 52 top-ranked flagship institutions that ACTA surveyed, 21 of them had policies that clearly and substantially restricted freedom of speech, and these, mind you, are public institutions where the First Amendment applies. We are also working very hard to put an end to accreditation as we know it, which has proven an intrusive and costly failure. I think, as you all will know, accreditation is the gatekeeping system for colleges and universities. In order to receive Title IV funds, you must be accredited, and we have been engaged literally for 20 years in showing the shortcomings of this system and are seeing some real progress when it comes to legislators thinking about this system. And I want to tell you, yes, there are many, many problems, but there are also many, many good signs of positive progress. Christopher Newport has just expanded its core curriculum, and so it's now possible for more students and their families to respond with their feet and wallets to what is a coherent curriculum and a very exciting program at this institution. University of Maryland trustees, including Tom McMillan, just adopted a resolution that ties coaches' bonuses to the academic success of their student athletes. The trustees at the University of North Carolina system have just assessed more than 200 programs, understanding that in times of limited resources, universities must focus on what they do best rather than trying to be all things to all people, and they have shut down some programs that were highly politicized. In Missouri, trustees and the governor worked hard to reduce administrative fat. At the University of Colorado, regents required a campus climate survey to determine whether their classrooms were open to the robust exchange of ideas, and they have expanded discrimination protections to include not only race and sex, but also political affiliation and ideology. Again, at Maryland, the administration has employed online technology to help students pick the right courses so that they can move quickly to a degree. The number of credits required was limited to 120, and students were required to earn at least 12 of them outside the classroom through online courses, because this, again, was a way that the university could substantially keep costs in line. So each university is unique, and there is no one-size-fits-all approach, but it is true good things are happening around the country, and that if we are going to have higher education, which remains the finest in the world, we are going to have more and more boards and more institutions exploring these kinds of options. Our universities right now have an incredible opportunity to restore the public trust, and the American Council of Trustees and Alumni is working very hard to help them do that. So again, I hope that you will look at our website, goacta.org, as well as whatwilltheylearn.com, and tell your friends to do so. And I hope you will also think about taking action to assist us in our efforts to improve higher education. As I say, vote with your feet and wallets for value. I think so often U.S. News and World Report is really the only rating out there, and it's very much one that focuses on inputs. What Will They Learn is really designed to take a look at what is the educational philosophy of the institution, because we think that really is what we should be looking for in terms of value added. So I hope you will rely on that as a resource. I hope you also will tell your congressman that accreditation is a regulatory failure and that there are better ways to serve as gatekeepers for Title IV money. The American Council of Trustees and Alumni has an alternative program which would allow schools to certify their financial health as well as various performance indicators. And if they were able to show that they had student learning gains based on a nationally normed test, they could go directly to Title IV, and they would not need to admit large teams of administrators and faculty who cost millions of dollars at many institutions and who intrude on the management and governance of our colleges and universities. I hope you also will be a watchdog when it comes to college and university trustees. For the most part, governors appoint trustees, and it's important that we hold them to account, to appoint folks who will be concerned about quality and affordability. Morton and I were talking earlier about Governor Gilmore. He was exceptional in his focus on making it clear to his appointees that the quality education and affordability were essential, and that is what they should remain focused on. Not all governors are quite so good at that, and so keep an eye on your public officials when they appoint their trustees and help them stay focused on looking at ways to have affordable education. Demand that institutions find ways to graduate students in 4 years. We now have started using data that only looks at 4-year graduation rates. We decided that many trustees we found were actually confused. They would get graduation rates from their administrators, but they were not told that they were 6-year graduation rates. They just assumed, since they had graduated in 4 years, that they must be 4-year graduation rates. So I think it's appalling that we are looking nationally at around 40%. So we need to really keep administrators focused on how they can find ways to get students through in 4 years. Speak out against administrative bloat. It is a sad fact that there are now more administrators than faculty in institutions across the country. And last but not least, we are very happy to work with alumni at institutions to create groups like the Society for the College at William and Mary, which Carla talked about, which came together in a concerted way to address various threats to quality and integrity and tradition at William and Mary. So that's it for this morning. I thank you very much for having me here today, and I will not assume that inviting me on April Fool's Day had anything to do with my discussion. So. Sure, and I'd be happy to take questions.
Okay.
Good morning, I'm Barbara Bowie Whitman, and I met my husband 25 years ago on this day, so I know that everything that happens on April Fool's Day is not a joke. But at any rate, my concern is exactly along the lines that you have mentioned, but I've had it in a fuzzy way, just the general feeling that today's graduates knew less than I knew when I graduated in 1962. I talked to the president of William and Mary about the fact that tuition had gone up so much, and my concern as an economist that part of this was if you let people borrow the money, you can inflate the price. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. You can look at housing markets in developing countries where the same square footage, just as nice as something in Washington, D.C., costs a whole lot less because they can't get a mortgage. So you inflate the price by letting people think that they can pay for it 20 years from now and maybe not pay at all. And he said, if we don't do that, we can't get good professors. So my concern is that issue, but also what you've done with this core stuff. People aren't taking the things we always said you had to know to be an educated person. I know you're organized to fight it back, but I'm not sure how you get people willing to take the courses and people willing to impose the requirements. I had a heck of a time balancing my requirements to get them all in, and I graduated in 3.5 years.
Yeah, well, I think you point out a number of really important things. I think the core curriculum issue is a critical one because, as you've said, nowadays college and university students can really graduate with vast gaps in their skills and knowledge because the curriculum is really established to be anything goes. And I think we can look at Christopher Newport as a pretty good example. Paul Tribble has realized that this is something that is lacking. And so the core curriculum, for better or for worse, is now becoming a special market. It's a special way to compete because it signifies to those students and those families who are paying for the students to go there what those students have learned and can do because you actually know what they are going to be studying and you know that they will have had that particular exposure. I think we're going to see more and more schools realizing that that is something that they can compete on. And if you look at Baylor, if you look at Pepperdine, these schools are making a big deal about the fact that they have an ACTA A core curriculum. They are happy happily advertising it, and I think that more and more parents are going to say to themselves, yes, this is in fact what we're looking for. It's no longer going to be the brand. It's going to be what is it that the student will actually graduate with. So I think that's very important. When it gets to the matter of cost, I mean, the third-party payer problem is a serious one when it comes, obviously, to federal financial aid and higher education costs. The lack of a coherent curriculum, the very diffuse hundreds of courses that are often offered, also very, very costly. So we're getting ready to issue a report later this year that is looking at the cost of a diffuse curriculum and how, if more and more schools would go back to a coherent core, not only can they ensure students are given exposure to key areas, they can also reduce the costs of an overly bloated curriculum. And then last but not least, I mean, what are the other ways that we could reduce the cost? One of the things is let's insist that faculty teach more. This is, again, one of the secrets of colleges and universities. They will do almost anything to keep the data from administrators and trustees in terms of how many courses faculty are teaching. But what we know anecdotally is that if you compare teaching loads now to teaching loads, say, 20 years ago, that most of our professors are not teaching at the same level that they did before. If we increase their teaching loads, we would be able to have greater access. More students would be able to get the classes. They'd be able to move through more quickly. And so there's some really interesting access issues if we demand teacher productivity, which is why I praise Governor Walker on his efforts in Wisconsin, because he has made the connection between a greater teacher productivity, more students getting through, and getting through more rapidly.
Yes, hello. My name is Lonix Lewistor. I work here at the Leadership Institute for the Technology Department. I remember when I first went to...
Is that working? Can you all hear him?
Oh, yes, yes. Can you hear me now? Yes. All right. So I just remember going to college and being in my first English comprehension class, and half of the class didn't understand syntax or sentence structure. So the professor had to spend the first 4 weeks of class trying to teach them a crash course in what their high school should have taught them in the first place. So I saw that disparity when it came to like certain education levels when it came to some of my classmates. But then I thought I'd be able to make a difference by joining SGA. And our SGA controlled about 40% of the school's budget. Now, with that, administrators had to come to us when they came to increasing the fees at the University of West Florida. Now, unfortunately, one of the things that they would constantly do is that they would just come to us and ask us to be able to increase tuition. And when we would ask where the money would go, they would talk about having nice chairs, and they would talk about having a new stadium, but they never really addressed anything when it came to education. And when we spoke about how are the students going to be able to afford this, their immediate reaction was, well, we'll be able to get you guys student aid. And then we asked them, is that going to be in scholarships or is that going to be simply in loans? And they responded in loans. And for some strange reason, my student government completely accepted that. Yeah. So both on the side of education when it comes to the failure of our high schools, middle schools, and elementary schools, properly preparing people for college, and our college's complete lack of being able to address the problem and just wanting money. What do you think is the real solution between those two things?
Well, again, we've found that students are some of the best spokespeople for not raising tuition. And so I urge more and more students to make their voices heard on college campuses. However, we have seen the same phenomenon that you did, that often they are convinced that if they don't raise their fees or whatever, that the chairs will fall apart and they won't have a wonderful, beautiful institution. But in fact, they need to be focused on education, and I think they can really call administrators to account for a fixation on amenities. I mean, we are seeing more and more schools competing on climbing walls and lazy rivers and all sushi bars and pedicure shops. I mean, it's just really quite ridiculous, and I think it would be wonderful for students to remind the adults on campus that they're there for an education and they're not there to play games. But unfortunately, we have seen a lot of that happening over the years.
Go ahead, Brian.
This is kind of a follow-up on Lonix's question there. I mean, I agree with you that the spending seems to be more on a 4-year entertainment experience than actual education. But what can we actually do from a conservative point of view? Because as you talked about, universities can do things to cut their costs, but they don't seem to really do anything to either A, cut tuition, or B, stop the borrowing game. And I'm well aware of what the Democrats want to do. They want to make tuition bailout program or make all the rich pay for everybody to go to college for free. But what is the conservative solution to this student debt problem that we're seeing that's almost about to be the next mortgage bubble in this country?
Well, again, I think you really need to focus on those institutions that are attempting to freeze tuition or cut tuition and who are really bringing costs under control. I mean, for instance, Mitch Daniels has now frozen tuition for the last 4 years at Purdue. We're seeing that happening at the University of Wisconsin, where Scott Walker is asking for a 4-year tuition freeze. So ACTA is trying to compile data about institutions and leaders who are making those kinds of efforts. And I think, again, that's where you need to go vote with your feet in your wallets and go to those institutions where you can see the adult leadership doing the right thing to try to keep costs under control.
So you guys are tracking the student and tuition freezes. Are you guys also tracking what they're doing with student fees? Because in a number of cases, they'll freeze the tuition, but they'll jack the student fees up, which is the same thing.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. And so we do try to track both of those things. But yes, I think we have to reward those places that are actually taking steps to deal with this cost crisis because, frankly, the trajectory is just not sustainable. And I mean, and it raises also an interesting question, which we've already seen in the state. How many schools can continue on this trajectory? Now, Sweetbriar, and there's quite a bit of debate about should Sweetbriar have shut down, could it have existed, and we could engage in that discussion. But what I think it really says is that colleges and university boards now have to realize that we are in a different world. I mean, if you looked at higher ed in the late 60s and early 70s, I mean, the spigot was always on. The money was not a question, but money is a question. And Clayton Christensen, who's at the Harvard Business School, has predicted that in the next 15 years, up to half of public and private schools could go belly up. So I think this is actually quite therapeutic, and I think there's nothing like potentially shutting down that can focus the minds of administrators and trustees, and which is the message we're giving to college and university trustees right now, that the same old is not going to work, that they cannot keep raising it indefinitely, and if they do, they're going to have a problem on their hands.
I'm Mike Hines, a Leadership Institute regular. My question relates to accreditation in Title IV. You said that accreditation is not a good gateway to Title IV funds because it becomes politicized. Is it possible to really change that? I mean, it seems as though there's a circular movement of funds, from taxpayers to the federal government to liberal institutions who train more Democrats and more liberals. I wonder, is Title funds a sensible thing to continue, at least at the great levels they are now? Can it be unpoliticized in any real way? I mean, that's the question.
Yeah. Well, it's a very good question, and I think there are certainly many who would argue to get the feds out of federal financial aid. The American Council of Trustees and Alumni has chosen to approach accreditation because it's not our expectation that the government will get out of federal financial aid, at least in the next few years. And so we felt that the best way to deal with it was to try to modify that gatekeeping. I think what we're seeing is more and more intrusiveness on the part of these accrediting bodies in ways that are deeply disturbing. Say what you will about the University of Virginia issue when they fired and then rehired their president. What was amazing to us is when the Southern Association of Colleges and Schools, which is the regional accreditor for UVA, chose to put them on warning, arguing that the faculty should have been given some input on the decision to hire or fire the president. So we filed a complaint with the Department of Ed against SACS at that time and said, how dare you put the University of Virginia on warning, arguing that the faculty should have been deciding who the president should be. This is an issue that is dictated by state law, and these accreditors who are basically unaccountable bureaucrats have absolutely no right to go in and second-guess governance and management decisions. Interestingly, after we filed this complaint, we got back an answer from the Department of Ed saying, well, these were standards that the accreditor had put into place under a provision which we call the blank check provision of the Higher Education Act. This allows accreditors to create standards of their own over and above those that are expressly set out by Congress. And the Department of Ed told us, well, whenever they set their own standards, we effectively have no review authority. So we then also filed an amicus brief recently in the Amtrak case and the Supreme Court case, as well as one in the Fourth Circuit. These were not all directly dealing with accreditation, but our argument is that in effect Congress has handed over legislative authority to private unaccountable entities, and that this raises serious constitutional issues and that we need to be worrying about this. So this is something that we are raising at the Capitol Hill level, saying that at the very least you have got to limit the power you've given to these unaccountable bodies, I might add, which are made up of faculty and administrators who generally are looking for more dollars, more input, less responsibility, rather than protecting taxpayer dollars, which was what Congress thought it was doing when it set up the accreditation system.
Question here? Wait for the microphone, please.
Homeschooling appears to be doing quite well. And I know that some of them are actually using the computer quite a bit to assist in that process. Can we use the computer a lot more effectively at the collegiate level, college level?
I certainly think that more and more colleges are going to be doing that. I mean, as I indicated in my example, the University of Maryland, they implemented having students do some online learning as a requirement because they discovered that it would be a way to reduce costs. And quite frankly, those who are a good deal younger than I enjoy working online. And interestingly, they've even done some research, and they have found even in classes like English and literature, that there are often students that can do well in an online experience. Now, we at the American Council of Trustees and Alumni believe strongly in a rich liberal arts education, and so we like to have the one-on-one interaction in a small classroom, but we also think that there can be some very excellent ways to use technology to learn as well.
I just have a clarification about your statement about the accreditation. My name is Norman Singleton. I'm Vice President of Policy for Campaign for Liberty. Prior to that, I spent 15 years on Capitol Hill. Having spent 15 years on Capitol Hill, I really don't want Congress writing, Nancy Pelosi and John Boehner writing the curriculum for college, because it's going to be, if you look at what comes out of college, it won't be, or what comes out of Congress now, I seriously doubt their ability to improve higher education by getting more involved in curriculum decisions. And I just was your comments could have been misconstrued, I'm sure, to suggest that Congress should be more involved in accreditation and overseeing college course offerings. So I just was
I think there's a difference between being involved with reforming the accreditation gatekeeping and being involved in curriculum. I'm certainly not suggesting that Congress should be involved in curriculum.
Is there another question? Go ahead.
Hi. What about the current generation of college students? Do they seem to have much concern about losing their free speech rights?
Very good question. And obviously, we work strongly with a group called the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education. This group is focused almost exclusively on speech codes and basically inhibition of free speech. And I think this is something that students should be very, very concerned about. Ironically, there are some students, I think, who believe that the free exchange of ideas and sometimes the often difficult discussions about controversial issues, that these are somehow counter to social welfare. And I think there are many administrators who would like students to believe that civility and that civility should trump all other qualities on campus. And so this is, again, an area where I think more and more students should be rising up and saying the First Amendment is an essential part of our system. We are here on our college campus, and particularly on a public campus, where the First Amendment is essential, and that any effort to trammel our ability to discuss issues and to hear a range of perspectives is wrong. And I think that, again, would be an incredibly powerful place for students to become more active, because we do tend to hear more often from students who are trying to shut down speakers than we hear from students saying, wait a minute, a liberal education is to liberate the mind, and that means we want to hear a range of perspectives, and we want to hear controversial speakers and others who agree or disagree with them. And too often that's not happening. And so I think that is certainly an area where students can be more vigorous.
Another question?
Hi, and thank you so much for coming today. Speaking on the subject of what students should be aware of, I'd like to ask a curriculum question. Being in the programs department here and seeing a lot of college graduates who don't have a resume or don't know how to apply for a loan or any other extending education initiatives that involve how to be an adult after graduating college. Is ACTA working to advocate on any curriculum similar to that, so that people who graduate from college actually have life skills that can get them a job?
We are not active in that area. We do try to find institutions that focus on those things and highlight that if they are doing it. For instance, I think Randolph-Macon has put into place a system that connects students with employers and that tries to take them and prepare them for success after graduation. So we are finding some institutions that realize that need and who are trying to put that into place. And if we know of that, we will try to highlight that, but it's not an area in which we have been active. Interestingly, the point you raise is something that I think many of the for-profit schools were aware of even before nonprofit schools, and we were hearing often of the for-profits that were doing how to dress, how to prepare for work, and we're actually focusing on those kinds of skills. It's definitely a need, and too often our institutions are not really preparing the students in that way. Something that you all, I'm sure, could really help them with. So,
Is there another question?
I've
And we
exhausted
thank you
you.
so much.
Thank
We
you.
appreciate it. Stay up here for a second.
Okay.
For the presentation. We really appreciate your coming. The Leadership Institute has a very active campus outreach. The current number, I believe, is 1,592 independent conservative student groups that are part of our campus leadership program. Well, it's my pleasure to present to you an Adam Smith scarf produced by the Leadership Institute. So we very much appreciate your coming.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.